Hello, welcome to the channel Wise Stories. Enjoy watching.
While cleaning a rich man's room, the maid found something strange. And when she answered a video call, she froze. Marietta entered the room and looked around. Okay, got it. Not much work here. Change the bed linen, dust, remove the cup of unfinished coffee from the coffee table, and, as per the routine, clean the bathroom. That's exactly what she expected. An elderly man had stayed here for 2 days. Well-groomed, intelligent, very wealthy. They had told her that Pasquale was a major businessman, the owner of a chain of restaurants in the capital. And Marietta immediately realized that he was no ordinary man. Over the years working at the hotel, she had learned to read people. Men like Pasquale Palomo don't give maids trouble. They are neat, polite, and clean. Tidying up their rooms is a piece of cake. Marietta approached the bedside table. Often, such guests leave tips, and generous ones at that. Sure enough, next to the lamp with the green shade, there was a thin stack of bills. Marietta counted them and smiled. How nice. This will be enough for the kids' school uniforms. With September around the corner, it's time to start preparing for school. Marietta silently thanked the pleasant guest and wished him good fortune in all his endeavors before returning to her cleaning. When it came time to change the bed linen, Marietta encountered a surprise. The woman lifted the pillow and found a medallion underneath. It was simple, made from some cheap metal. Clearly, it was a trinket, and old at that. It didn't seem to fit with the image of a respectable elderly businessman. Senor Pasquale had worn an expensive watch on his wrist, and his suit was by a famous designer, clearly custom-tailored. But here, some cheap medallion, how strange. Marietta picked up the unusual object. The casing was bent in several places, but the medallion itself was clean, with no rust or scratches. It was clear someone had taken care of it. Apparently, it was something of great value to Pasquale. Marietta brought the medallion closer to her eyes and noticed that it opened. Curiosity got the better of her, and Marietta pried the lid with her nail. It gave way surprisingly easily. What the astonished woman saw inside was an old black and white photograph. It showed a smiling young woman with strong white teeth, dark eyes, a braid wrapped around her head in an old-fashioned style, and a round mole above her lip. Marietta stared at the portrait of the woman in amazement. Familiar, pleasant features. The woman thoughtfully touched the mole above her own lip. She had inherited it from her grandmother, Gaspara Landeros. And in fact, everyone said that Marietta looked a lot like her. And now she was looking at an image of her own grandmother. The photograph had been taken when Gaspara was still very young. There was no doubt about it. Marietta even knew exactly which photograph had been used for the medallion's portrait. She had seen it many times in the old family album. In that photo, her grandmother was standing by a river, surrounded by weeping willows. The sun was shining brightly, and her grandmother was smiling. She used to tell Marietta that a photographer rarely visited their village, so it was a major event. That's why Gaspara dressed up carefully before posing for the photo. On the very day the picture was taken, she had borrowed a beautiful dress from a friend and even put on a little makeup. Marietta kept staring at her grandmother's laughing face. Gaspara had been gone for a long time, passing away when Marietta was still a teenager. Her grandmother's death was a heavy blow for Marietta, as she was the person she felt closest to. Marietta had loved Gaspara more than her own mother. In truth, her grandmother had practically raised her while her mother was trying to find herself and build her personal life. Gaspara's cozy village home often hosted the grandchildren of her sons, Marietta's cousins. Gaspara loved them all, giving them warmth, comfort, and care soft as a blanket. Even her voice was soothing. But Marietta and Gaspara shared a special bond. That's why her grandmother's passing was such a huge loss for Marietta. It was hard for her after Gaspara's death, but she endured and adapted. Her grandmother always told her she was strong and brave, that she could overcome anything, no matter how difficult it might be. And she had. Not as well as she had hoped, But still, Marietta wasn't living on the streets, and she provided decently for her children. She had managed to pull through. Marietta rocked the medallion in her palm, closed the lid, and fell into deep thought. What is this? How did this happen? A portrait of my grandmother Gaspara in a cheap, old medallion that belongs to a wealthy businessman. It was clear that there had to be some connection between Pasquale and Gaspara. It couldn't just be a coincidence that the man carried her photograph. Or could it? Maybe Pasquale was a collector of retro items, and Gaspara's photo had simply crossed his path? Who knows? Maybe he was a descendant of that photographer, or there was some other link. Still, her gut feeling told her, no, Pasquale and my grandmother Gaspara definitely knew each other. And they were probably quite close. Something connects them. Now Marietta felt she had to find out exactly what that connection was. She continued cleaning, the medallion now tucked into the pocket of her uniform apron. Technically, she was required to hand in any items found in guest rooms to the hotel manager, who would then contact the previous guest to arrange for the return of the lost item. But this time, Marietta decided to handle things differently. She had to find Pasquale herself. She needed to talk to him, to understand why he carried a photograph of her grandmother, her beloved grandmother. Anything related to Gaspara was important and precious to Marietta. Her grandmother remained one of the most significant and cherished figures in her life. Marietta still missed her, and this discovery felt like a message from her beloved grandmother. It even warmed her heart. No, she couldn't let this opportunity pass. While it was still summer and before the children went back to school, she had some free time. Marietta would get to the bottom of this. She would have to travel to the capital, which would take a whole day, 3 hours each way by train, and then who knows how long she'd need to stay in the city. She might even have to spend the night. But that wasn't a problem. The children would manage. Andera was already 14, practically a grown young lady. Mauro, a year younger, was a responsible and serious boy. They could handle looking after 6-year-old Leah, and it wouldn't be their first time doing so. Their mother was constantly at work, trying to provide for her children. The older ones understood this perfectly and didn't mind taking on some of her household duties. Marietta had good children. Sometimes, she could hardly believe she had managed to raise such responsible kids. But she still worried about their future. They were smart, and they needed to study, but would she have the resources to give them that opportunity? She hoped so. Marietta dreamed that Andera, Mauro, and Liao would grow up, get an education, and become successful. But she knew a lot of it depended on her. As she continued cleaning the room, her thoughts wandered to her own life. She started remembering the past. It was probably due to the unexpected encounter with her grandmother Gaspara. Her hands worked, but her mind was far away. Marietta had been born from a fleeting, casual romance. Her mother, Elise, had just turned 18 at the time. She had no education, no prospects, and no real plans for the future. Elise had always been like that, flighty, romantic, and far too carefree. In school, she barely scraped by with passing grades, not because she wasn't smart, but because Elise preferred parties and dates. Studying seemed silly and boring to her when there was so much fun and excitement around. So, Elise skipped school, went on dates, and mostly with guys much older than herself. She didn't find boys her age interesting, they didn't have jobs, couldn't buy her gifts. But her older suitors already had jobs and could afford to treat her. Her grandmother, Gaspara, was constantly beside herself with worry. She had raised her children alone after her husband died. He drowned while saving a woman in a lake when his youngest son was just a month old. Gaspara was left alone with 5 children to care for, 4 sons and her daughter, Elise. Of course, the widow had to return to work early, and she worked like 2 people, because how else could she feed such a large family? Many men courted Gaspara, as she was strikingly beautiful, but she refused them all. She had no time for that. She devoted all her time to her children and her work. Her boys grew up to be upstanding young men, taking after their father. They helped their mother around the house, did well in school, and were involved in sports. But her daughter, Gaspara, couldn't understand what was happening with her beloved Elise. Elise had always been lazy and spoiled, but in her teenage years, it was like she'd been possessed. The skipping school, the constant dating. When her mother tried to talk to her, Elise would respond rudely. Neighbors advised Gaspara to deal with her wayward daughter with strictness and force. Gaspara tried, but it didn't work. One day, after a particularly distressing parent-teacher meeting, she came home upset and scared. She grabbed a switch, raised it over the frightened Elise, but then lowered her hand. Gaspara had raised all her children the same way, but this is how it turned out. The boys never gave her trouble, but her daughter more than made up for it, causing problems on behalf of all 5 of them. Over time, Gaspara accepted it, convincing herself that Elise would calm down as she grew older, just like her husband's sister had. She had been the same, but after getting married, she became an exemplary wife and mother. After graduating from school, Elise expressed a desire to move to the city. Why? Gaspara asked, surprised. You barely passed school, no one will take you, you won't even pass the exams. Who needs school? I'm going to make money, you know how much money circulates in the city? And where exactly are you going to work? What can you even do? I'll find something, there are so many opportunities. I know for sure. People told me, Elise confidently replied. You're not going anywhere. Gaspara stood firm, her heart telling her that her daughter would be lost in the city. There were so many dangers, and Elise, she was spineless and had nothing but wind in her head. You can't stop me. Elise smirked arrogantly. I turned 18 last week. I go where I want. I'm an adult now, got it? But this so-called adult needed money to get started. Gaspara ended up giving Elise all her savings, though she hated the idea of sending her daughter off to the city without a cent. Mama, why are you indulging her? Fidel, the eldest son, scolded when he found out. Maybe if she struggled a bit without money, she'd realize she's not capable of anything, understand that she needs an education, and come back. The other sons were upset too, feeling that all the savings went to their flighty sister instead of being divided equally. But Gaspara was convinced she had made the right choice. Without money, who knows what kind of job Elise would have ended up with. Elise moved to the city, and for almost a year, there was no news from her. Occasionally, neighbors' children who worked or studied in the city brought back rumors. They said Elise was living with some man and didn't work, just took care of the household. Gaspara was astonished. Elise and household chores? How is that even possible? But she secretly hoped that her wild daughter had finally calmed down and that everything would turn out well for her. Unfortunately, these hopes were not meant to come true. One stormy autumn evening, Elise appeared at the door of her childhood home. By then, her brothers had all gone their separate ways, some to study, others for work, leaving Gaspara alone in the house. When she saw her daughter, Gaspara gasped. The once beautiful Elise had become a gaunt and unkempt figure, her hair disheveled, her face swollen from heavy drinking, her skin taking on the unhealthy tone common to those who drink too much. The most surprising thing, however, was that Elise was holding a baby. Wrapped in a faded, hand-me-down orange blanket. Meet your granddaughter, Elise croaked, her voice hoarse. I named her Marietta. Gaspara nearly collapsed from shock. She hadn't expected to become a grandmother again. Now she had 3 grandchildren, 2 from her eldest son and 1 from her daughter. She let Elise and the baby into the house. It turned out that Elise had lived with an older man named Arlo for a while. He was from another town, had a falling out with his family, and left to start a new life. That's when he met Elise, and they hit it off, bonding over their shared love for a carefree, party-filled lifestyle. Arlo worked in construction, doing side jobs here and there. They lived off his earnings, which were irregular but decent enough. He was handy, and such people were always in demand. If only he hadn't been such a heavy drinker, he would have been perfect. Eventually, Elise realized she was pregnant. At first, Arlo wasn't thrilled, but he quickly saw the financial benefits. Children meant child support payments, and stopped pressuring her to get an abortion. By the time Marietta was born, everything had changed. Arlo somehow reconciled with his lawful wife and returned to his hometown, leaving Elise to deal with her problems alone. After leaving the hospital, Elise stayed in their rented apartment for a while, which had been paid up until the end of the month. Then, with nowhere else to go, she returned to her mother's house. Where else could she go? Gaspara pitied her wayward daughter and reassured her that everything would be fine. "I'm here, we'll get through this together, we'll raise the girl." "Thank you, Mom." Gaspara was even somewhat relieved by how things turned out. She believed that now Elise would finally get her act together. Children tend to help people mature, but once Elise had somewhat recovered, she left for the city again. She left her daughter with her mother, but Gaspara never saw any of the child benefits. The irresponsible mother received them in the city and spent them on herself. It was hard for Gaspara to raise Marietta, but she never complained. Her granddaughter was like a ray of light for her, a source of happiness and energy. Elise would show up occasionally when she ran out of money or lovers and needed a place to stay. She had no warm feelings for Marietta. Neighbors suggested that Gaspara should strip her daughter of parental rights. That way, she would receive more benefits, and life would be more peaceful for everyone. But Gaspara couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt sorry for Elise. Besides, she still had a small hope in her heart that Elise would eventually come to her senses and settle down. But nothing came of it. In the end, Elise disappeared. They searched for her for a long time. She was found in another region, in a prison colony, where she had ended up for theft. She never made it out of there. She died within those cold, gray walls from a collection of illnesses she'd acquired over years of reckless living. Gaspara mourned for a long time, crying and blaming herself, thinking she had failed in raising her one and only, dearly beloved daughter. As for Marietta, she felt nothing when she heard the news, absolutely nothing. Her mother had always been a stranger to her, almost unknown, and even unpleasant. But when her grandmother passed away, Marietta truly suffered. It was as if her world had turned upside down. She was still very young then, barely 16. She was taken in by her eldest uncle's family, but his wife didn't like her niece. She tried not to show it, but Marietta could feel it. She understood everything. Even her uncle treated her with a certain coldness. Her brothers had never liked Elise because of all the trouble she had caused the family. Apparently, they transferred these feelings onto Marietta as well. After her grandmother's death, Marietta felt lonely and abandoned, even though, technically, she had relatives. But Marietta knew she couldn't rely on them. She could only depend on herself. Remembering her grandmother Gaspara's advice, Marietta planned to continue her education. After finishing school, she enrolled in an economics college. Her grades were good. She had always been diligent and hardworking. As an orphan registered in the village house, Marietta was entitled to a dorm room, which she was given. She was happy to move out of her relative's house, tired of constantly feeling like a burden. At first, she devoted herself entirely to her studies. Then she met Javiero Alcaraz. He was a young man, handsome, with blue eyes. He had come to Marietta's college to visit a friend of his. He saw the young girl, smiled at her, and a light, easy conversation began. Marietta melted under his gaze. She hadn't felt so warm and at peace in a long time. It seemed that here was someone who truly cared about her. Javiero asked her out on a date, and Marietta happily agreed. With him, she felt safe, as if behind a stone wall. She so wanted to believe that her loneliness had ended, that she had found someone who was ready to take care of her. Javiero seemed just that, sensitive and reliable. After the date, he invited her to his hotel room. Marietta agreed without a second thought. It was only later that she realized what was happening, but she didn't resist much. After all, they would be together now. But Marietta was mistaken. Javiero disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. From the friend he had visited, one of the college staff, Marietta learned that Javiero was already married with 3 children. He worked as a truck driver, traveling all over the country. Marietta realized she had become just one of his many one-night stands. It was disappointing, but there was nothing she could do about it. She went through the disappointment, made important conclusions for herself, and continued living quietly until she realized she was pregnant. She rushed to the women's clinic. Marietta didn't even know what to do. So, when the doctor told her that she had missed all deadlines for terminating the unwanted pregnancy, Marietta was almost relieved. At least she wouldn't have to make that choice anymore. The baby was going to be born. Of course, a host of problems arose for the young student. How would she study? Where would she live? How would she manage? Overwhelmed with worries and concerns, she missed her exams and was expelled. Well, she wouldn't have been able to continue studying with a baby anyway. She had to return to the village, to the small house of her grandmother Gaspara. The elderly woman had transferred the property to her granddaughter right after her daughter's death, which once again caused dissatisfaction among her sons. "It's okay, they're successful and established, they won't go hungry," Gaspara explained to the neighbors, and Marietta heard it all, "but the girl definitely needs her own place, it will make her feel more secure in life." Now Marietta was glad to have somewhere to go. The house, which had been neglected while she stayed with her uncle and then in the dormitory, had fallen into disrepair. Nobody had taken care of it, but Marietta wasn't scared off. A roof over her head was enough. She did her best to make the place cozy. Then Andera was born. This event turned Marietta's world upside down once again. She looked at the tiny baby with tenderness and warmth and understood that she would move mountains for this little bundle. Now Marietta was even more puzzled by her own mother's actions. How could someone willingly abandon their own child? To prefer a daughter to strangers and parties? Marietta became a model mother. She started receiving child benefits, which made things easier financially. Marietta learned to budget, stretch her food supply, and buy items on sale. Despite being a young mother, she managed to handle things reasonably well, which made her feel proud and strong. Her plans were to keep Andera until she was old enough to go to daycare, and then work at the local post office or library. Maybe even finish her studies someday. She needed to find her place in life. But the young mother's plans were not meant to be fulfilled. Serafin Teodoro came to the village. Marietta knew him. He was the son of the neighbors, 5 years older than her. He had studied, moved to the capital, and reportedly had been hired by a large company as a student. Serafin had come to take his ill mother to the capital, where the treatment would be better and life more interesting. Marietta had once been in love with him, as had a good number of women of various ages in their village. So, Marietta was not opposed when he came to visit her. Serafin was already drunk, having met with friends beforehand, apparently. "So this is how your life turned out," the young man shook his head, while Marietta admired his intelligent gray eyes. "It's a pity, you were such a smart and beautiful girl. I thought a different future awaited you. Maybe it still will." "Maybe," Serafin said uncertainly. Then he began to talk about himself, about his life. To the villagers, Serafin seemed to embody success and good fortune, but it turned out that things were not so simple. Serafin was deeply unhappy inside. Career achievements didn't come easily. He had to adjust to others and sometimes even swallow his pride, groveling before those in power. Serafin and Marietta woke up in each other's arms. When he sobered up in the morning, he was horrified. He felt awkward, blushing, apologizing, and hurriedly left Marietta's house. It was painful for Marietta to see and understand all this. The evening before, she had felt a deep connection with him. It seemed like they understood each other very well. She wanted to believe it was the beginning of something big, beautiful, and real. But soon after Serafin left, Marietta realized she was pregnant again. It was a blow to her. She understood that she could not get rid of the child. After all, Andera was already here, small, sweet, alive, and inside her was another tiny baby. She couldn't bring herself to harm it. Marietta didn't want anything from Seraphin from the start. Where would she even look for him? Even if she found him, he was unlikely to be pleased with the news. Marietta didn't want to deal with him. She decided she would manage on her own. Morrow was born. With 2 small children and no money, life was tough for Marietta. But the children brought joy, gave her strength, and served as motivation. No matter how difficult things were, Marietta still felt happy. Neighbors whispered, comparing her to her mother, saying the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It was hurtful. Unlike the woman who gave birth to her, Marietta had not abandoned her children. She loved them, raised them herself, and devoted every spare moment to them. Andera and Morrow grew up, bringing their mother joy with their excellent health and intelligence. Bright, neat, and friendly, the siblings always had fun together. The children went to kindergarten, and Marietta started working. However, it wasn't at the post office or library as she had hoped. Those positions were no longer available, so she worked in a cowshed. The work was hard, but the pay was decent by village standards and, importantly, regular. Marietta no longer thought about returning to school. She simply didn't have the strength or time. Grandmother Gaspara's house continued to deteriorate. Everything in it needed repair and the touch of male hands, which Marietta couldn't manage on her own. One day, she realized that things couldn't continue like this. They needed to move to the city and sell the house before it fell apart completely. So Marietta did just that. With the proceeds, she rented an apartment in the city for a year and immediately began looking for work. It was easier to find work in the city. Marietta worked everywhere, in cafes, restaurants, as a kitchen helper, as a cleaner, and even worked as a cashier. However, due to constant shortages, she had to quit quickly. There was plenty of work for those who weren't afraid of hard labor. The children went to kindergarten, and Marietta earned money. She even managed to save a little for a rainy day. Overall, she was quite satisfied with her life until the children started school. That's when the problems began. Expenses for repairs, buying various supplies, and paying for school trips for her son or daughter all required significant financial outlays, and Marietta's earnings were not enough. She had gotten used to economizing and barely making ends meet. She thought she was managing the financial difficulties well, but it turned out she needed to earn much more. And as the children's needs grew with gadgets, fashionable clothing, Marietta didn't want Morrow and Andera to feel inferior among their classmates. But what could she do? She had to take on extra work. There were always openings for cleaners. Now, Marietta was constantly exhausted. Work, home, children, brief sleep, and then it all started over again. She had become a shadow of her former self. Sometimes the despair was so overwhelming that it was hard to breathe, but Marietta held on for the sake of her children, her son and daughter. She tried not to show them her fatigue or fear. Sometimes Marietta was overwhelmed by sad thoughts. No stable job, no home, no education. Yet she had 2 small children and had never been in a serious relationship. She was even embarrassed to admit it to anyone. In the entire world, she had no one to turn to for help. Her uncles? They had never liked her mother, and so they had no feelings for their niece. And they shouldn't have, to be honest. She couldn't rely on them. They were complete strangers. It was terrifying to feel so alone and helpless. No matter how hard Marietta worked, she still earned only enough to keep a roof over her head and food on the table, nothing more. Fortunately, Marietta and Morrow understood and didn't demand the impossible from their mother. On the contrary, they helped as much as they could, taking on household chores, cleaning, and even cooking. Their mother was always at work. Marietta would come home exhausted, quickly grab a bite, check on the children, finish up any household tasks, then wish Morrow and Andera good night, and fall asleep before her head even touched the pillow. A few years later, Orlando Granados entered Marietta's life. He was a man slightly older than her, serious, quiet, working for an apartment repair company where Marietta cleaned 3 times a week. At first, she didn't notice him. Orlando didn't stand out in any particular way. But then he helped her carry full buckets of water up to the 4th floor and volunteered to clean the window sills under the ceiling. Being tall, he could reach from the floor, while Marietta would have had to risk her safety on a shaky ladder. One day, Marietta realized that this man cared about her, doing things that no one had attempted before. The discovery pleasantly surprised her. She looked at the quiet Orlando with new eyes and noticed that he had a rather pleasant appearance. They started talking, and Marietta learned that Orlando had lived in the village before. He had a family there, wife and children. But his wife began to criticize him for his small earnings, and eventually she left him for another man, taking the children with her. Orlando was left all alone, broken and disoriented. He decided to move to the city for work. Everything in his hometown reminded him of his past life, the betrayal of his wife, and the way people looked at him, some with mockery, others with pity. Orlando didn't like those looks. In the city, he rented an apartment and found a job. Handy Orlando earned well from repairs. He not only worked at the company but also did side jobs on the side, unofficially. He had gotten used to this calm, measured life. He even began to enjoy it until Marietta came along. At first, the man felt sympathy for the young, attractive woman who had to work so hard to support 2 children. Abandoned by everyone, unsupported by anyone, Marietta was struggling against all odds. Then other feelings began to emerge. Orlando suddenly realized that he wanted to be near this woman, to care for her and protect her from life's hardships. He wanted to be the strong wall she could rely on, providing her with the comfort and security she longed for. Marietta listened to him and felt waves of happiness spreading through her body. Every word Orlando spoke was sincere and meaningful. Of course, doubts flitted through her mind. What if he was lying? What if Orlando was just like the previous ones? He could spin a web of lies, play at love, and then disappear. What did it matter to him? It was hard to fully trust this person, but Marietta decided to take the leap and didn't regret it. Orlando moved in with them and immediately took on all the traditional male responsibilities. He fixed the plumbing issues, wallpapered the walls, painted the rooms, replaced the bathroom tiles, and finally hung the curtain rods correctly. The house instantly became cozy and beautiful. It turned out that Orlando was not only a jack of all trades, but also an excellent cook. He could create incredible dishes from nothing, from leftovers in the fridge. With him around, Marietta almost forgot about financial problems. Orlando earned well and enjoyed spending. He bought quality groceries, treats, clothes for the children, and gifts for Marietta. Morrow and Andera quickly accepted and loved him. And he, in turn, was very warm toward the children. Marietta worried there might be problems here, but she worried in vain. Orlando often took Morrow and Andera out. Sometimes he took them to the movies, other times to the amusement park. He helped them with their homework, played with them, and engaged in long conversations on various topics. Marietta couldn't believe her happiness. Her life became brighter, happier, and fuller. She no longer worked multiple jobs. There was no need for that anymore. She had the energy to live, to find joy, and to rest. Most importantly, Marietta was no longer alone. She had someone she loved who loved her back. She was cared for, supported, protected, and cherished. The feeling was indescribable. A couple of years of happy family life flew by, and Marietta had grown accustomed to it. She believed it would continue this way. So, the news of her new pregnancy made her happy, and Orlando was overjoyed. He began planning their future home. Renting was affordable for Orlando, but he wanted stability. 3 children were a significant responsibility. So, he took on extra work, sometimes working on construction sites, unloading trucks and trains, anything to save a little extra money. And then the unthinkable happened, something Marietta could still remember with shudders. Orlando was hit by a truck at the construction site. Fatigue and overwork led him to violate safety regulations, and Marietta couldn't believe her beloved was gone. She was alone again, face to face with a cruel and uncomfortable world where such terrible things happened. Marietta felt as if a concrete slab was pressing down on her chest. The world became gray and expressionless, almost unreal. The thought of a future without Orlando was unbearable. It sparked panic. During that difficult period, Marietta wished the world would truly collapse, just once and then be gone, but those were dangerous thoughts. She knew she had to live, had to stay strong for her children, who also struggled with the loss of a loved one. And she also had Orlando's baby growing inside her. He had to be born healthy and strong. So, Marietta pulled herself together for the sake of her children and continued the fight. Fortunately, Orlando had kept his savings at home in a hidden place, not in a bank. Otherwise, Marietta wouldn't have been able to access the account. They never got around to getting married, though they had planned to. The tragedy at the construction site had dashed those plans. But there was money for the funeral and for the family to get by for a while. And then, as usual, Marietta was no stranger to hard work. Soon Liao was born. While she was still a tiny baby, times were tough. The family barely survived, stretching their modest food supplies for as long as possible. The children wore old clothes passed down from others, but there was nothing to be done. Survival was the priority. As Liao grew up and started attending kindergarten, Marietta went back to work. Fortunately, the little one rarely fell ill, so her mother was able to work without taking sick leave. The income increased, but it was still catastrophically insufficient for a comfortable life. Nonetheless, Marietta didn't lose hope. Time passed, and as the children grew, things got a bit easier. And then came a dream job offer. One of the residents of the building where Marietta cleaned floors in the mornings offered her a chance to interview for a position at a local hotel. You're slim, attractive, and used to hard work. That's noticeable. And most importantly, you know how to smile and interact with people. We need someone like you at the hotel, and there's a vacancy for a maid right now. Give it a try. It's better than cleaning dirty staircases, he said. Marietta decided to give it a shot. She didn't believe much in her chances, but she succeeded. She was hired at the hotel. The job was clean, calm, and even pleasant. The salary was more than decent, and there were tips, sometimes quite generous. Life became much easier. Marietta still missed Orlando, his care, his voice, his scent. She was still a single mother of many children. Yet life began to brighten again. Marietta even managed to take the children to the seaside once. It was their first time by the coast. The sea views were absolutely fantastic. They were all still in awe and dreamed of repeating the trip someday. Marietta struggled with the realization that she was alone again. It was even frightening. If something were to happen to her, where would the children go? Her uncles likely wouldn't take them in. They weren't even aware of their existence. They hadn't been in touch for a long time and had become complete strangers. Marietta often thought of her grandmother Gaspara. She knew it was impossible, but she imagined what the world would be like if she were still alive. Gaspara would probably live with them, read bedtime stories to the children, bake pancakes for her great-grandchildren, and call Marietta her sweet girl, hugging her. Gaspara remained the most significant figure in Marietta's life. So, when she found Gaspara's photo in a cheap locket under the pillow of a wealthy businessman, she was deeply shaken. Marietta couldn't wait. She had to find out what was going on as quickly as possible. Finding information about Pascual Palomo in the digital age took just 5 minutes. Marietta learned that he lived and worked in the capital. She found the address of his main office and learned his working hours. The next morning, she was already on a train, gazing at the passing landscapes through the window. Marietta had taken a day off from work, unpaid. She had given the children instructions for the day, confident they would manage. They would cook, clean the house, go out, and pick Leah up from kindergarten in the evening. Everything would be fine. Marietta hadn't told Morrow and Andera the real reason for her trip. It sounded too strange and unusual, so she made up an excuse about work. Marietta fiddled with the locket, examining it, occasionally opening it to admire her grandmother's photo. Would Pasquale accept her? He was a busy man. And if he did, how would he react to a maid finding his locket? Would he be angry? Maybe he would think she stole it. What could connect him to Gaspara? Marietta couldn't even come up with plausible reasons. What if it was something unpleasant? Marietta was anxious and worried, but she knew she had to find Pasquale and talk to him. Marietta left her rented apartment early in the morning and arrived at Senor Pasquale's office by the afternoon. She entered the building, answered the receptionist's question about her destination, and to the woman's surprise, was not stopped. The receptionist, a polite and smiling young woman, simply directed her to the office where the boss was. Later, Marietta learned that she was fortunate to have arrived during visiting hours. This was the time when anyone could come and speak with Senor Pasquale about his restaurant, whether to complain, offer suggestions, or express gratitude. Pasquale believed it was crucial to keep a finger on the pulse to stay on top. He always paid close attention to feedback from clients, competitors, and partners. Marietta entered Pasquale's office without any obstacles. She had expected something more elaborate and luxurious, given that he was a very well-known and wealthy individual, but it seemed the man preferred simplicity and functionality, which was endearing. Marietta entered, greeted him, and Pasquale welcomed her with a friendly smile, inviting her to sit in a chair opposite his desk. His open gaze and sincere smile helped Marietta to compose herself. Her nervousness receded, but she still wasn't sure where to start. All the prepared phrases had suddenly vanished from her mind. "Do you have a question or maybe a suggestion for me?" Pasquale prompted. "Don't be shy. You can say whatever you want. I welcome honesty and respect the truth, even if it's not always pleasant. So, you can tell me anything that's on your mind. Did you have an issue with the service at the restaurant or something wrong with the kitchen?" "No," Marietta shook her head. I came to you with a different matter." With these words, she pulled the locket out of her handbag. "I'm a maid at the hotel where you stayed. I found this item in your room." Pasquale's expression changed, his eyebrows raised in surprise, and a joyful glint appeared in his eyes. "So, you found it," he said, clearly pleased. "I was worried, thinking I must have lost it at the train station. I was sure I had put the locket in my pocket before leaving the hotel, as I always do." "You left it under the pillow," Marietta said. "Ah, old age, not a joy," Pasquale joked. Marietta handed the locket to its owner. He quickly took it into his hands, smoothing the cover with his thumb. It was clear the item was very precious to him. "So, you came all the way to the capital just to return it to me?" Pasquale said thoughtfully. He studied Marietta intently. "Well, why not? You could have handed it to the receptionist, and they would have called me. I would have sent someone. Why go through all this trouble?" "The thing is," Marietta said, "the person in the photo is my grandmother." Pasquale shrugged his shoulders, no longer smiling. His face took on a serious expression. "What's your grandmother's name?" "The one in the photo." "Gaspara." "Gaspara. I can't believe it." Pasquale looked deeply shocked. He glanced from the locket to Marietta and back, his cheeks flushing red. "Please, tell me, how do you know my grandmother? And why do you carry her photo with you everywhere?" "You see, she was my closest person. I had no one closer to me, and never had. She raised me, and it's important for me to know everything about her. You see," Pasquale continued, "it turns out that your grandmother was probably the closest person to me as well. I searched for her for a long time, then realized it was futile. And then you. I want to know. I understand, this won't be a short conversation. Perhaps some coffee?" Marietta shook her head negatively, saying she wasn't in the mood for coffee right now. Pasquale nodded in understanding and began his story. Pasquale was born in a remote village to parents who drank heavily. From childhood, he knew neither love nor affection, growing up like a weed. He took care of himself as best as he could. Neighbors sometimes helped, providing food when his parents went on benders for weeks. Pasquale didn't yet realize he was living in unacceptable conditions, nor did he understand that adults were supposed to love, protect, and care for children. He thought everyone lived this way and thus didn't worry much about his fate. Such suffering was alien to a small child. Gaspara was then still a very young girl. From the adults, Pasquale knew she had no parents. Gaspara was kind and cheerful. She often treated Pasquale to candies and sometimes called him by the strange word maubli, ruffling his hair with her hand, which he found pleasant. Then, a fire broke out in the house where Pasquale lived with his parents. This happened during another of their drunken parties. Pasquale was used to these endless celebrations. The adults fought, laughed, talked, argued, kissed, and fell asleep right on the floor. Pasquale played quietly in the attic or slept there, wrapped in an old coat of his grandfather's, whom he had never met because he had died before Pasquale was born. But Pasquale knew that this worn, tobacco-scented coat once belonged to his grandfather. That night, Pasquale woke up, struggling to breathe. The boy got up, coughing. The night was moonlit and starry, but the room was enveloped in impenetrable darkness. Something black was swirling around, burning his eyes and irritating his lungs. Smoke. Though Pasquale was only 7 years old, he realized that a fire had started in the house. Surely one of the adults hadn't put out a cigarette. Grandma Pablo, when she scolded his mother and father, often said that they would one day burn the house down. And it seemed her prediction had come true. Fear overwhelmed Pasquale. He opened the attic window. Could he jump down? But the ground was too far, and he might break his neck. He didn't want to go back into the smoke-filled room, but there was no other choice. Pasquale made his way down by touch, stumbling over scattered belongings. Below, the scene was unimaginable. Flames crackled and roared, quickly consuming wallpaper, curtains, and furniture. The exit seemed so far away. Something burning was falling from the ceiling, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. Pasquale had never been so scared in his life. He screamed, but there was no one around. Where had everyone gone? Had they burned or fled, leaving him alone? His head was ringing. Pasquale tried to inhale but couldn't. His head spun, and everything around him blurred. The boy fell into darkness. Before losing consciousness, Pasquale thought he was dying. So, he was very surprised when he opened his eyes to see stars high in the sky. Breathing came easily, and the cool night air was refreshing. Someone was carrying him in their arms. Pasquale turned his head and saw the worried, soot-streaked face of Gaspara. She had rescued him from the fire. "Alive," the girl exclaimed. "Thank God, you're alive. I thought I was too late." Then Pasquale noticed other people gathering around him from all directions. Someone wrapped the boy in a blanket, someone gave him water. Pasquale looked back and saw flames devouring his home, bursting out from the attic window. The place he had left just moments ago. "Gaspara, you pulled a living soul from the fire," one of the men said. "We men were afraid, but you saved him. You're an amazing person." Gaspara took Pasquale in with the thought, the boy has no home now. He's alone, I'm alone, so we'll be together. Later, Pasquale learned that his parents had perished in the fire. He was surprised, but not particularly upset. It was just strange to realize they were no longer there. The fire had indeed been started by one of the drunken guests. Some of his parents' friends had fled, while others burned with the hosts. Pasquale might have faced the same fate. He had lost consciousness due to the smoke, but before that, he had managed to scream. Gaspara heard the cry. She was among those who rushed to the fire, hoping to help the victims in any way she could. The flames raged inside, their reflections visible in the windows, and black smoke poured from every crack. Gaspara was advised against it, even held back, deemed the effort useless. But she heard the child's cry and couldn't stand by. The brave girl dashed into the burning house, found the child, and carried him out in her arms. The fire singed her eyebrows and eyelashes, which took a long time to regrow, and scars remained on her palms. She was burned while rescuing the boy, but all of this was nothing compared to the joy of knowing the boy was alive and well. Pasquale enjoyed being with Gaspara. It was clean and comfortable. She was cheerful and kind, reading books to him and telling stories, taking care of him. She gave me a real birthday party, Pasquale recalled with a smile. It was the first time for me. She baked a cake, bought me a gift. I remember it clearly, a football. She invited the local kids. That's when I started playing with other children. Before that, they had somehow excluded me. Gaspara was a very young woman, but she cared for Pasquale like an experienced mother. The girl and the boy lived together in harmony. She taught me so much. It must have been hard for her. I was completely wild, truly a Mowgli. Gaspara taught me how to use cutlery, make the bed, and interact with people. She taught me the alphabet and then reading. Most importantly, she loved me very much, hugged me, and often said kind words. I thawed out next to her. I transformed from a wild little beast into a human. I thought it would always be like that. Gaspara decided to adopt Pasquale and handle all the necessary paperwork. It turned out to be more complicated than expected. A lot of paperwork was needed, and she had to run around various offices. So, Gaspara left Pasquale with the neighbors and went to the city, thinking she would be gone for a week, but the process stretched out to almost a month. Gaspara knew Pasquale would miss her, so before leaving, she left him the very locket. Look, I'll be with you. If you get lonely, just open the locket and look at me. You can tell me all your worries and troubles. I'll hear you through the locket. I promise. So don't worry, even though I'll be far away, I'll still be close. During the time Gaspara was away, Pasquale's relatives appeared. Some distant aunt and her husband. This woman suddenly wanted to take me in, Pasquale said, but don't think it was out of any genuine family feelings. Nothing of the sort. Later, I found out it was all about the inheritance. My wealthy grandmother died, and that meant my mother and I became her heirs. So the aunt jumped at the chance, took me in to get hold of my share. And she succeeded. Pasquale was taken far away, to a city on the other side of the country. The boy cried. He didn't want to leave his village or part with Gaspara. This girl had become closer to him than a mother. She saved his life, helped him become a normal person. She gave the lonely boy love, care, and taught him everything. But no one asked for the child's opinion. The adult neighbors thought it was the right thing to do. A child should be with relatives, not with a young stranger. Gaspara is still almost a child herself. She needs to get married. Have her own children. You'll go to your relatives, that's the right thing to do, they said. On the way, the boy had a real breakdown. The aunt quickly stopped it with a sharp slap. Subsequently, she didn't treat her nephew any better. They didn't love me, they just tolerated me, barely because of the inheritance. Life there was cold and uncomfortable. I tried to stay out of the house, joined every club at school that I could, just to spend less time with them. When Pasquale turned 14, his loving aunt sent him to a boarding school in the countryside. At 18, Pasquale joined the army and became a driver. After being discharged, he didn't even visit his relatives, to their undeniable relief. He rented a room and got a job at a dairy factory. His boss noticed the sharp-witted driver and helped him get into university. Pasquale didn't want to go, but you can't go against the boss. Unexpectedly, he got into it, became the best student in his course. Everything developed from there almost on its own. After graduating, Pasquale was invited to work as a manager at a well-known restaurant. There, the young man gained experience and gradually developed a plan to open his own cafe. He saved up money for the down payment and started his own business. It was tough. Ups and downs, learning from mistakes, working from morning till night. Pasquale immersed himself in every detail, trying to understand and control everything. Eventually, he succeeded in creating a chain of restaurants with an excellent reputation. Now he had everything: money, a beloved profession, power, and strength. Pasquale tried to find Gaspara. Not right away, but later, when he had the means to do so. He wanted to see her, thank her, and look again into the kind eyes of the person who gave him life, even though she wasn't his biological mother. To tell her about himself. Pasquale knew that Gaspara would also be interested in his fate. But many years had passed, and the village where Pasquale was born and raised no longer existed. Finding Gaspara proved impossible. Pasquale, as it turned out, knew almost nothing about her. Only her name and approximate age. Even hired detectives couldn't solve the case. "This locket has been my talisman all these years," Pasquale said, shaking his head. "It gave me strength. I don't know how to explain it, but I really did talk to Gaspara. Even later, when I grew up and understood she couldn't actually hear me, it just became a habit. I would complain about my aunt or the mean teachers. And it really did help. It was like a kind of psychotherapy." Pasquale married and had children, sons. If he had had a daughter, he would have named her after Gaspara. Over time, Pasquale came to accept that he might never find the woman who saved his life. And then, Marietta with the locket appeared. It was incredible. It was incredible that the last gift from Gaspara was found by her granddaughter. Your grandmother. Pasquale hesitated to ask the most important question, but Marietta understood and shook her head sadly. She wished she could bring him joy, but Gaspara had been gone for many years. "Well, of course, she must have been very old by now," Pasquale said, shaking his head in sadness. "But you know what? This is no coincidence. Gaspara must have brought you to me on purpose, I'm sure of it. It's a miracle that we found each other, and now we'll never be lost again, right? I'll introduce you to my family. They know about Gaspara and will be very happy to meet you." There was so much hope in Pasquale's voice that Marietta smiled. It seemed that he was like a foster son of Gaspara. Another relative, but unlike the others, he hoped for communication, for friendship. Marietta needed that too. They stood in the old village cemetery. Pasquale and Marietta. The man looked at the cracked gravestone, holding a bouquet of roses. Pasquale turned out to be a simple and very pleasant person to talk to. They had grown close over the months since they met. Pasquale's family welcomed Marietta and her children warmly. Now they were family, close and dear, all thanks to Gaspara. Her big heart, her kindness. Marietta suddenly realized that Pasquale wanted some time alone. She stepped aside, pretending to search for the grave of someone she knew. She saw Pasquale whispering quietly, probably needing to say many things to Gaspara. Later, Pasquale and his grandchildren, and Marietta with her children, would go to the movies, spend a warm, family evening together. Yes, Marietta now had a family. And it was happiness.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.